Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Heather, and on this channel I like to walk a very fine line between a shopping addicted makeup monster and a responsible adult with a makeup hobby. Now, I really enjoy eyeshadow singles, duochromes, multichromes, blush, highlight, lip gloss, basically everything except pressed glitter, and today we're going to be ranking all of my cool toned palettes. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, stick with me, we're getting into it right now. Okay, and I believe we have 34 palettes to rank. These are predominantly cool toned neutral type color stories, but there are pops of color in several of these palettes. I have my palettes typically arranged in color story order whenever I put them into my collection. So if you guys ever want to see a ranking for like greens or blues, purples, pinks, warm tone neutrals, let a girl know. All right. Coming in at 34 is Melt Mary Jane, and this is one of the most painful palettes I've ever used in my entire life. In fact, whenever I got it, I attempted to use, I believe it was Sweet Lucy on my lids, and I got this horrendous, it was like rocks scraping across my eyelids. It was so painful. I immediately contacted Sephora, and they were like, oh no, you can just toss that palette, like we'll refund you the money. It was wonderful. And I kept it around because I was like, maybe I'll use the mattes in here at some point, and I haven't, but I don't know why. I like struggle to actually throw it away, but every time I look at it, I remember how much pain and irritation my lids had, and I never want to go back to using it. Coming in at 33 was the Star Wars palette from Colourpop. Now this was I think the second palette that they did, and I was really excited for this color story and then kind of let down by the actual quality. These two shades here are these like marbled shades, and I thought they were going to be really like dynamic and sparkly, but they just end up coming across very muddy on the lids, which was very disappointing. The metallics in here are fine, the Super Shock is fine, and the mattes are fine, but it's a lot of fine to mediocre, so it fell pretty low on the list. Then last up for sort of the bottom end of the spectrum here is the 669 palette, and this is from Martine Cosmetics. I always put this one towards the bottom in rankings because the multichrome formula is so thin and hard to work with, and I feel like you just don't get a lot of bang for your buck. The multichromes in here, this one, that one. But everything else in here is pretty decent. I do like the mattes and the metallic, like more standard metallics in this palette. It's just the multichromes. Coming in at 31 is Thor, Love and Thunder. This is the Valkyrie palette, and it looks like this. Now, I think this is a cute little 8-pan color story. I do really like the sort of soft blues here, and I like the purple. I like the smoky gray. I could have done without these two sort of neutral shades, and I do think the silver is quite nice as well. It's an Ulta branded product though, so the formula is kind of mediocre. So for me, it fell down pretty low because of that, but if this color story were made by a different brand, I think it would go a lot higher. Next up is Urban Decay Naked Smoky, and this one has been around for a minute. I've used this one several times, and I do like the color story, but I feel like a lot of the indie brands have formulas that well surpass the quality of Urban Decay at this point. And so this one doesn't get as much love anymore for that reason. I do still like the packaging. I think this is really cool, like smoked out acrylic, and it's part of why I still keep it. Plus there's like a nostalgia factor for me. Next up is Morphe Lunaris, and this particular palette has like the 5 smaller pans, 4 bigger pans, and you can use these two as a highlight shade. They're sort of like a more PC formula. This one I really like the duochrome in here, and I really like the sparkly quality of this particular metallic shade. The mattes in here are nice, but again, they're just very straightforward mattes. It's a Morphe branded product, so it's not like going above and beyond. It's a decent price. I think this was like $18, but with the discount at Ulta, of course, you can get it down to like what, $14.50, something like that. So it's decent, but there was just a lot of stuff I liked better. Then I have Colourpop Cloud N, and this particular palette I think is pretty, but when they do the palettes with these larger pans, I feel like the metallics get pressed really hard, and then I feel like they don't have as much like color payoff and intensity in the actual eye looks. So this one I sort of have to pair with other things to kind of bring it to the level that I want it to be whenever I just want to use this palette. Again, the mattes in here are quite nice. This sort of metallic silver has kind of an undercurrent of like a robin's egg blue, but you lose it entirely on the lids. So I feel like that's one of the things I have to sort of bump up a little bit. The pressed glitter in here I haven't used, but I did get some eye irritation the first time I used other shades in this palette. So I'm not sure if that was coming from that glitter sort of contaminating the other shades or not. An oldie but a goodie, Lorac Pro. Oh my gosh. And I think, is this Pro 2? Yeah, this is the 2. And I got this palette way back when because of this navy shade. I loved the olivey shade here and this purple. Like those 3 shades sold me on this palette, and I use this a lot. Lorac shades are beautiful. The mattes are so like velvety. I really like using them a lot. The metallics are they're very plain. They're not super like sparkly or piecey. They're not very dimensional, but they get the job done. They're serviceable. So for me, again, for the time that I got this, it was amazing, and the nostalgia factor is part of what keeps it in my collection. But today, I don't think this palette could compare with some of the other things I have coming up. Next up is the Troublemaker palette from Colourpop. And again, this one is one of the larger pan-sized palettes, and I think the metallics in here are pressed pretty hard. You sort of lose the duochrome quality of this one because of how hard it's pressed. This silver though slaps. So the silver is what saves this palette and makes it rank above other things. I do kind of like the addition of these plummy purple shades in here too, because I think that makes it a little more interesting than just a gray palette. But overall still, it's just not quite there. Like it's almost there, but it's not quite there. Right. And then Natasha Denona Glam palette. Now this is one of the older formulas, right? And now that she's released some of her other cool toned color stories, this one definitely does not hold a candle to those. I originally purchased the Alter Ego version of this palette, and then I was like, no, I need the original. Bought the original. I think I've used it like 3 times, and then I was like, all right, that's enough. So definitely could have saved my money on that one. But I like the color story, but I think now that I see other color stories that are cool toned, this feels a lot warmer than it used to when I first got it. So it falls a little lower in the ranking because it's not quite what I'm looking for at this point. Next is the Revolution Pro Earth and Stone palette, and I don't think you can get these palettes anymore, which is kind of a shame, but they were dupes for the Pat McGrath palettes. They originally duped them pretty closely, and then they released a couple that I think were their own color stories, maybe to just sort of hide the fact that they were blatantly copying everything Pat McGrath. But this particular palette, I do think it's pretty. I love the iridescent and then the more traditional duochromes that are in this palette, and I like this really intense forest green. The mattes in here, nice and soft and buttery. They kind of remind me of Lorac in terms of that sort of like smooth quality, but the whole color story in general, I don't really come back to very often, so it came pretty low for that reason. All right, Trevor and Dose of Colors, Eternal Love. Now, I think I have a video on my channel of this palette, and it definitely is more alluring in pan than it is in person or in actuality. Like when you use the actual colors and put them on your eyes, they are not nearly as intense and interesting as they are in the pans, and that's somewhat disappointing. Again, the purple, the blue, this kind of limey chartreuse green, and then this duochrome with the pink undertone, those colors really sold me on this palette. But what I ended up liking the most was actually the mattes, because the mattes in this palette make a beautiful gradient, and then you can build any of the metallics off of it. Again, for me, I think the metallics are not quite as intense as some of the indie branded stuff that I have, so the metallic duochrome kind of shades fell a little short for me, but when I mix this with other palettes, I do really like it, which is why it kind of fell towards the middle. Next is Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas and Colourpop. And I do really like this palette. It's definitely like one of the heftier palettes that Colourpop has created. I'm disappointed by this duochrome, this blue-brown duochrome. Colourpop does not seem to be able to do it. I think this is the 3rd palette I'm showing you with Colourpop that has one of these shades in it that is just not cutting it. So that's kind of disappointing, but I do really like the neon pink that's in here. I like this very cranberry shade. I like the blue, although I wish it was more intense, and I really like the black and the gray shades in here. The orange and gold I don't tend to use very much, but everything else in there I quite like. Next is a drugstore favorite. This is the Profusion Euphoria palette, and mine came a little bit smashed, so I had to sort of repress it. But I do think this is a really pretty color story. I love the intensity of this shade Element. It's like a plummy black metallic, and then it has like rose and green sparkles all through it. Very, very pretty. No Clue is just a beautiful taupey kind of silver shade. You have an iridescent white shade, beautiful mattes to work with. I really like the colors, like the color selection in here, and I like how they work on the eyes. I think they perform very, very nicely for a $5 palette. So If you're interested in something from the drugstore that's cool toned, consider this one. And I have another one from Profusion coming up here shortly. All right, next is Gloss God's Smoke and Mirrors palette. And this was the first palette that I ever picked up from them. I really like this silver and this sort of like gunmetal shade down here, and I think the multichrome in here is very special as well, but the mattes are very, very thin. I feel like they're somewhat patchy on the lid, so they were kind of a disappointment, but the metallics are definitely what saves this palette for me. I don't think I would order another one from Gloss Gods though, unless it was one of their all like duochrome or multichrome palettes, because I just don't like their matte formula. Next is the Flower Beauty and ET palette, and this packaging I hate so much, but the actual color story itself I think is pretty cool. This really is like an accompaniment to other things. I don't really use this for its own like full color story, but I do really like Extraterrestrial, Over the Moon, Do You Talk, and Be Good. These 4 shades here I think are really stunning. The other 4 shades I can kind of take or leave, and that's why it falls to kind of the middle of the road. Next up we have the teeny tiny Viseart Petite Pro. This is the Etoile palette, and it looks like that. Very beautiful little color story here. The mattes in this palette I think are really, really pretty, and they smoke out quite nicely. The metallics in here, similar to like a Lorac formula, they're very soft, lightly pigmented. They're not super sparkly. You're not going to see like a lot of texture or anything, but just not quite as much as what I want on my lids, so they fall a little short for me, but I do overall like the color story a lot. Next up is the Cara Beauty. This is the, which one is this? Dare to Be Shocking. Dare to Be Shocking. And they're kind of these like magazines. There was 3 of these palettes total that came out, and I did pick them all up at TJ Maxx. I think they were like $7.99 each, which was an awesome price. I do really like this color story quite a bit. I love that you have like some navy, some gunmetal grays. You've got a ton of mattes to create a nice gradient. And then I like the sort of like pops of minty and more like chartreusey greens. I think that is very complementary to the gray and blue color story. So for $7.99, I think this is a phenomenal deal. If you haven't tried Cara Beauty out yet, I would consider it, because I've liked their quality a lot. All right, then we have ABH Sultry palette, and whew, looks so pretty on camera. There are shades that I really like in this palette, and then there are some shades that I definitely don't turn to as often. Because it's very cool toned, I keep it with the rest of my more like gray toned, cool toned palettes, but it definitely is warmer, kind of like the Natasha Denona Glam, and so I don't reach into it as much. But the silver shade down here, Cyborg, beautiful, beautiful. You guys, I have like murdered my fingers this week. I was chopping jalapenos and sliced down into my finger, cut off part of my fingernail and all the way down into like the base of my finger. Then today I'm trying to open some Greek yogurt. I slice my finger open on the foil lid to that. I'm breaking nails left, right, and center. I'm like, I cannot win with my hands this week. All right, next is Lorac Pro Noir. And this one, again, it's that beautiful, soft, buttery Lorac formula that I really, really appreciate. And I really love these like deeper metallics here. I like these 2 lighter metallics as well. Some of these like golder metallics I don't care as much for, but everything else in here I really like. I think you have a great gradient, just like Eternal Love, a really beautiful gradient in here. And these palettes are magnetized, so you can take them out and rearrange them. The one drawback to that is that they decided to then just put the names on this little sheet instead of putting them in the palette. And I hate that. I hate the sheet. Just put the names on there, and I don't care if they're not right if I move them around. Like, next is the Venus Immortalis palette from Lime Crime. And I think this might be the only palette I have from Lime Crime in my collection. Maybe. I like this palette a lot. I think it's a very interesting color story. The mattes that they picked in here work really nicely together, and even this sort of like red toned matte, red toned brown, I think works really well with everything else in here. The mauve shade is a gray, but it has like iridescent pink in it, which I don't think translates very well on camera. I think it just looks gray on camera, but in person I think that's kind of an interesting touch. And then the marble, like pure white, I think is very beautiful. Every time I go in here, I end up picking Hail much more so than the shade, because I like the even cooler taupier silver undertone of this one, more so than the like not necessarily warmer but more golden undertone on this one. This is probably one of the most colorful palettes in this particular ranking, but it is very cool toned, so I leave it in this bundle of palettes, although I probably shouldn't. But this is the Unicorn Gang Shop, I forget the name of this palette, some kind of mermaid something or other, but anyway, I think this is a pretty color story. I do really like the combination of shades in here. It's definitely cool, grungy, dark, which I really like. Metallics in here leave something to be desired. They're a very standard, like, private label kind of metallic, so for me they're kind of so-so, but this combined with other palettes I think is a winning combination. Next up is Profusion Smoky, and this palette, I don't know, it just has that same sort of like taupey kind of silvery shade in here. You've got some beautiful mattes that form a nice gradient. I like the inclusion of the plummy purple shade in here. I could really live without that sort of red shade, but everything else in here I quite like. And for $5 at the drugstore or at a Walmart, this is a really banging palette. I think the quality far exceeds the $5 price tag. If I remember correctly, I used to have like maybe 12 of these palettes and I decluttered almost all of them, but I kept Smoky, I kept the Euphoria, and I think I kept the yellow one and maybe the green. Everything else I think I got rid of because I was like, it's just not my favorite, but there's something about these palettes that I still have that I just can't let go of because they're so good. All right, coming to the end of the Colourpop saga here is the Darth Vader palette. And I really like this color story. Again, the grays in here are beautiful. I love this sort of like burgundy maroon shade here. I think the gunmetal silver shade in here pairs so beautifully with the Super Shock that's in here. I even like this black with all the pinkish red sparkle in it. I think that's very beautiful for on the lids or like to smoke out along your lash line. I think it's a nice touch. So overall, I really like this one. And you know, it's affordable, it's small. The cover art is like somewhat appealing, somewhat like interesting. So we are getting into the top 10 now, I believe. So coming in at number 10 is Nabla Dreamy 2. And this palette is definitely just cool tones all the way around. I really like the sort of like navy and purple shades that are in here. This metallic has that sort of iridescent to yellow gold kind of an undertone to it, and that's not always my favorite shade, but I do think the sparkly quality of this one is quite nice. The mattes in here are nice, although this one is one of their, what do they call them, vinyl mattes? I guess it's like a cream to matte formula. It sometimes is hard to work with. But everything else in here I really like. And then these sort of like brassy bronzy shades I usually just skip right over, but everything else in here is great. 9 is the Night and Day palette from Revolution, and it's the mimic to another one of the Pat McGrath palettes, and I just think this is a really pretty color story. Obviously the smoky neutrals that are in here are quite nice. I do really like the duochrome shades that are in here, and the pop of the super deep blue that catches the light so beautifully when you wear it that this one definitely had to come up pretty high for that reason. And then its counterpart is the original Pat McGrath. This I got as a gift from my aunt, so this is coming in at number 8. And again, it looks quite similar. Who's surprised? Nobody. And the shades in here I think are just a little bit more impactful than what's in the Revolution palette, but overall I think this is a really pretty color story. I would almost give the Revolution palette a little bit more credit because you get a very similar color story without having to spend almost $130. So if you're looking for something on a budget, I think the Revolution is the way to go. I don't know if they still make that palette though, unfortunately, so you may be beholden to whatever you can find on Mercari, but in general I think it's a beautiful color story and I'm kind of happy to have both. All right, number 7 is the Chucky palette from Glamlight, and I am not a horror fan. Like you guys know, if you've been around here for a minute, I don't care at all about horror movies, but I do think this color story is quite nice. Again, it's got those like smoky grays and burgundy shades. I do really like the black with the red sparkle that's in here. The metallics that are in here are super impactful. And so overall, I've really enjoyed getting to play with this palette. The Glamlight formula is one of my absolute favorites. So this one is a very wonderful palette that I've enjoyed working with. Because the Glamlight formula is so wonderful, I can overlook all of the horror movie nonsense to enjoy the color story. All right, number 6. Huda Jaguar. This is one of the Wild Obsessions palettes that came out a while back, and I think I have all three of them now. The red orange one was the last one to pick up, but I do really like this one the best. Again, you have some beautiful mattes in here. This metallic-y purple duochrome shade is super like glossy across the lids. It gives a lot of sparkle, a lot of light in that area. And then I do really like these sort of deeper gunmetal shades as well. I think those are very, very beautiful. Could have done without the gold. I don't think I've even got into it once. And this purple shade is a little bit underwhelming, but everything else in here makes up for it. All right. Now, as far as the last 5 palettes, I could definitely reorder these depending on like my feelings on the day. But I tried to consider like if I could only keep, like if I had to keep eliminating one, I had to give it away, what would I give away next kind of thing to try to get an order for this video. But all 5 of these are awesome palettes. So coming in at number 5 is Lunar Beauty's Eternal Eclipse. And this one, again, just beautiful row of neutrals here in the center. And then you've got these lovely blues down here. This silver is like pure tinfoil on your eyes. It's absolutely stunning. And then I love that you have sort of 2 different kind of gunmetal-y shades to pick from. Sparkly black in here is quite nice. Again, I don't think that necessarily shows up on the eyes too much because the sparkles kind of blend away to nothing, but I do think it's pretty to look at in the pan, gives a little bit more visual interest when you're actually doing your eye look. Coming in at number 4 was Melt Muerte, and at first I was like, oh, that has to be number 1, and then the more I looked at other stuff, I was like, oh yeah, this is not going to be number 1. But it made it up to number 4, which I think is cool. I do like the combination of the sort of like burgundy reds here with the deep navy blues and grays. The pops of teal I probably could have lived without, and this iridescent kind of champagne with red I could have probably lived without as well. This Katrina Denim Blue Metallic, I have not been able to replicate that in all of the other palettes that I have in my collection. I can't find anything that is just like that, so that's kind of the special shade in this particular palette. But overall, I think it's a beautiful, like, smoky, grungy color story. Coming in at number 3, Natasha Denona Xenon. And I think a lot of people did not like this palette, but I really liked this palette quite a bit. And this is what the color story looks like. I will concede there are definitely some redundant shades in here. Like you have several sort of like light shades. Did you need all those? No. You have these 2 shades, which are pretty similar as well. You've got these 2 shades. This one is like a navy cream de matte. This one is more of a black cream de matte, but they definitely look very similar on the eyes. But the metallic duochrome type shades in here are so sparkly and so beautiful on the lids that I don't care about any of that. The shade Snowbird, Stellar, Super Ionic, Cygnus, and Neve? I'm not sure how you pronounce that. It's got accent aigus on both of the E's. Anyway, these shades are super pretty. I love the sort of dimensional PC sparkly quality to the shades. So this one came all the way up to number 3 because the metallics saved it. I think the Galaxy packaging is pretty cool too. Coming in at number 2 is Glamlight Hersheys Cookies and Cream palette, and this one is just like this cute little palette, right? It's so unassuming, but it's so beautiful. Again, the Glamlight formula for metallics is awesome. I think the mattes in here blend together very nicely, and I don't even so much mind the neutrals that are in here. Like I actually sort of this mustardy undertone I actually don't mind as much, but overall I definitely lean towards the blues a lot more. The blue silver kind of color story is my jam, and this one is such good quality that it had to come all the way up to number 2. And then coming in at number 1 is Odins Eye Christmas Eve. And this is one of the palettes that released last year and then they restocked them this year. I think this is such a beautiful color story, and it's one of the more colorful, cool tone neutral palettes in my collection, but I think the colors work so nicely together. The metallic and duochrome type shades in here are absolutely stunning. This one I believe is also, yeah, this is a multi-chrome. Goes from like red to blue at the extreme angles. Really, I think this is a beautiful color story. If you have this palette, I definitely would encourage you to get it out and play with it more, because I think even the blending of the different undertones, like the more mustardy, pukey greens here, the more sagey greens here, the blues, the grays, I think they just go together so nicely that you just can't help but rank in this one number 1. All right, and with that being said, that is everything for this video. I want to thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you in my next one.